The Aris lecture this year marks a double anniversary. And it's wonderful to see so many of you here. Some of you have come from far away, have flown in today or yesterday. And it's really fantastic to see so many old friends of Tibetan studies in this room today. The Aris lectures were created in 2015 to celebrate the contributions of Michael and Anthony Aris to Tibetan and Himalayan studies. Michael was the first to teach Tibetan language and cultural history at Oxford, and Anthony published the most magnificent books on Tibet and Asia more broadly through his publishing house, Sirindia. This year we are not only having the 10th Aris lecture, but it is also 10 years since Anthony Aris passed away. And I'm sure that many in this room will have been thinking of him and the Aris family on the occasion of this anniversary. Both Michael and Anthony had been working hard to create a dedicated academic post in Tibetan and Himalayan studies at Oxford to ensure teaching in this field long term. This post finally manifested thanks to the generosity of the Rousing family and with the help of the Aris Trust, and Charles Ramble was appointed as the first post holder in the year 2000. This is now 25 years ago. And we are therefore also celebrating 25 years of the master's and doctoral program in Tibetan and Himalayan studies. To mark both anniversaries, the 10th Aris lecture and also the 25 years of Tibetan and Himalayan studies, the format of the Aris lecture today is a little different from other years. First, of course, most importantly, we will hear the Aris lecture, which will this year be delivered by Lopen Karma Phuntsok. After the lecture, there will be 4 short speeches that reflect the trajectory of Tibetan and Himalayan studies from Michael Aris's time until the present. After that, around 6:30 approximately, you will be invited to join us for refreshments in the buttery at Wolfson, which is just across the courtyard, so you don't have very far to go. We are aiming to finish the evening around 9 o'clock, and those who wish to celebrate longer are invited to relocate to the famous Wolfson bar afterwards if they wish. But now to the Aris lecture itself. I'm delighted that the speaker this year is Lopen Karma Phuntsok, who is not only a distinguished expert on Tibetan Buddhism and Bhutan, but also a good long-term friend of the Aris family. Karma Phuntsok was born and raised in Bhutan. He received full monastic training in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, first at Chakri Dorjidin Monastery in Bhutan, and then at Sera Monastery and at the Ngagyor Nyingma Institute in South India, where he has also taught in later years. In 1997, he joined Balliol College, Oxford, first for a master's degree in classical Indian religions, and then for his doctorate, which he completed in 2003. His postdoctoral research took him to Cambridge and to Paris. He's the author of numerous publications on Tibetan Buddhism and on Bhutan, including his 2013 book, The History of Bhutan, which received the Choice Outstanding Academic Title Award. In 1999, he founded Loden Foundation, a charity committed to promoting education, nurturing social entrepreneurship, and documenting Bhutan's cultural heritage and traditions. His work has received extensive media coverage both in Europe and in Asia. He has managed documentation projects in Bhutan, directed ethnographic documentaries, and serves on several boards. In 2024, he became the first Bhutanese recipient of the prestigious Ramon Magsaysay Award for Transformational Leadership, an award that is often labeled the Nobel Prize of Asia. Quite fittingly, Lopen Karma Phuntsok's lecture today is also related to his social and educational engagement in Bhutan and is titled, "A Nation in Transition, Can Bhutan Become a Model of Progress in the VUCA World?" And this acronym VUCA is used to describe the current state of this world in terms of its volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. So, Dr. Karma Phuntsho, the floor is yours. We look very much forward to your lecture, and please make Karma Phuntsho very welcome.
Thank you, Ulrike. How wonderful to be back in Oxford. So many old friends, colleagues, and many familiar faces. Friendships, meetings, chance encounters, and even passing glances have a very profound spiritual significance in the Himalayan Buddhist culture. Especially in Bhutan, connections between people are called delwa. They play a very instrumental role and have power in building spiritual relationships, but also social capital, political alliances, and community solidarity. They signify reaping the results of past associations, enhancing present relations, and sowing seeds for future connections. So in this nexus of intricate karmic pathways, this crisscrossing vibes and energies in this entanglement of samsara, the Bhutanists believe it is a karmic connection, what we call ledrel, to be brought together. It was such a karmic connection that brought Michael Aris, a young British man, to Bhutan in 1960s, when foreigners were very rare in the country. And here we see Michael enjoying a ceremony alongside Bhutanese royalty. I suppose it was also such ledrel or connection that brought me to Oxford. I remember the cloudy afternoon of 29 September 1997 when I was picked up from Gloucester Green bus station by my old friend Barbara Spencer and taken to Ulrike Green. And she asked me if I had contacted Michael Aris. I said I've been corresponding with him but had no response. She picked up the phone immediately and called St. Anthony's College. And as I said, can I speak to Dr. Aris? A rough voice on the other end said, Dr. Aris just left. Are you the Bhutanese monk Karma Phuntsho? The person happened to be the porter at St. Anthony's Lodge. And he said, Michael has asked him to take my number. And when Michael returned the call, I asked him if I could come and see him. And he said, I have a car. I will come and see you. He came to Ulrike Green a bit later and then took me on a tour of Oxford. After that first meeting, Michael and I spent a lot of time together talking about things, places, and people in common. And a strong bond grew between us, mainly due to our common interests in Tibet, Buddhism, and especially Bhutan. He also introduced me to Kim, to Anthony and Marilaw, Lucinda, Roderick, and Arabella, who he made me marry on my first Boxing Day in the UK. And news spread to Bhutan that I've married Arabella myself instead of marrying her off. So in 2000, when I went to Bhutan with Marilaw and Anthony Aris, a lot of curious people assumed I came with my in-laws. Now, short of a marriage, I had still become an honorary member of the Aris family. And these memories, so intimate and warm, seem like another lifetime. But there's one particular memory that is still very acutely felt and vivid. And that's the tragic loss of Michael about a year and a half after we met on 27th March 1999 on his own birthday. In the last days of his life, Michael was very anxious about Sue, who was under house arrest in Burma, about Kim and Alexander, but also about the state of Tibetan and Himalayan studies at Oxford. I remember Michael then in his final days meeting Lisbeth Rousing and other supporters to secure the position for Tibetan and Himalayan studies here at Oxford. since then. Anthony, Marilou, Charles, Ulrike, Lamachap, many others have carried on that mission. And here we are today, celebrating 25 years of the center and 10 years of Aris lectures. So my heartfelt congratulations to all of you who contributed to this. So here's a picture of me and Michael, and me manning off Arabella. During my time at Oxford pursuing my doctoral degree, I remember comparing myself to Frodo on a precarious journey beyond the familiar traditional Shire to a vicious academic land of Mordor. Michael was my Gandalf, whom I lost too soon, and without whom I had to make the rest of the journey. Michael was not only my guiding light in finding my ways in the alien Western world and the intricacies of academic life, but he opened my eyes to my own world. Until I met Michael, my main work was focused on Buddhist studies, particularly on philosophical systems. I nearly spent half of my life then outside of Bhutan and didn't even fluently speak the national language. My conversations with Michael revealed to me that Bhutan remained a largely uncharted area of study, with only a few foreign researchers who could gain access to Bhutan, speak one of its languages, and even fewer Bhutanese who took up academic study of the country. With no barrier to access, intimate connection to the communities, advantage of having several local languages, and over a decade of education in the higher Buddhist culture of Bhutan, it was opportune for me to take up the academic study of Bhutan and its cultural heritage. So it was Michael's inspiration and the realization of such advantage that I started working on Bhutan. Sadly, Michael did not live to see my works on Bhutan, a continuation of the academic enterprise which he started long before I was born. So today I stand here to share with you some insights that I've gained from my lived experience, my academic work, and social engagements in Bhutan in the last 25 years or so. Now, I see absolutely no need for the audience today to tell you where Bhutan is. 20 years ago, I was on a flight to Beijing, sitting next to a Chinese lady. We introduced each other. I told her I'm from Bhutan. And 15 minutes later into the conversation, she turned to me and asked, "So what do you eat in Africa?" Bhutan today is better known and is being variously described as the last Shangri-La, a bastion of Vajrayana Buddhism, and has been commonly seen as a country associated with happiness, some people even claiming that it's the happiest place on earth. Now, I would probably take that with a pinch of salt, but it's no doubt a country that is exotic and has managed to build a happiness brand. What I hope to do today here is to give you a more realistic and objective picture of current and past situations of Bhutan. Firstly, I want to confirm that Bhutan is a very colorful country, colorful society with complex and sometimes even confusing and contradictory cultural compositions. For instance, you would find a very robust culture of celibacy with many monks and nuns, but at the same time, a very libertine sexual character of the Bhutanese men and women. You would also know that it's a vulgarity to refer to sexual organs in Bhutan, but at the same time, many of you might have seen the phallic symbols ubiquitous on our houses, in art, and during festivals. Similarly, one can find a very serene monk Buddha meditating right next to a blood-drinking, animal-headed deity in open sexual union with a consort. So, how has such complexity and diversity come to be? How do we explain and reconcile the contradictions? The first factor is really Bhutan's natural topography. Bhutan starts at a low level of about 150 meters above sea level in the plains, and rapidly rises up through steep foothills and gorges to the midlands, where you have the main cultural heartlands, and rises further up to alpine valleys and meadows, going all the way to the highest unclimbed point on earth, Kankar Pinsum. So in about 120 kilometers, which is not a lot longer than the distance from here to London, as the crow flies, you can go through many bioclimatic zones in Bhutan, rendering Bhutan a biological hotspot. And such diversity in the natural surroundings inevitably resulted in great cultural differences among pre-modern societies which relied heavily on their immediate surroundings. For instance, I grew up eating buckwheat as a staple food in my village at 3,200 meters above sea level, when my cousins ate maize and corn as their staple food, and people in Western Bhutan had rice as their main food. I grew up wearing wool as our normal clothes because we come from a shepherding community, although now there are no sheep left. But other parts of Bhutan had cotton and silk farming. Not only is Bhutan sort of rugged in terms of north to south, but even going from east to west, the country is fiercely divided by high passes, deep valleys, big rivers, thick forests, that communities lived isolated lives with many valley cultures, languages, and dialects. So we have quite a number of ethnic groups within a small space, and some 24 languages spoken, out of which 16 are considered to be endemic to Bhutan. Although Bhutan's high religious culture has common origins and family resemblances with that of Tibet, the folk culture based on heavily forested surrounding is very different from that of the Tibetan plateau. Bhutan's dress culture, such as the female dress kira, for instance, and also our habit of chewing betel and eating large quantities of chilies, they are much closer to the Indian subcontinental culinary culture than to Tibet in the north. So the geographic location is one factor. The second factor is Bhutan's geopolitical situation, and thereby its cultural situation as well. If one asks a young Bhutanese today where Bhutan is, they would say Bhutan is a small landlocked country sandwiched between India and China. And that geopolitical description is accurate, and it's a very precarious one, especially when we have the two powers having military standoffs, as they had in 2017, right at the edge of Bhutan at Doklam, a disputed area. But as a cultural scholar, I try to look beyond the geopolitical situation and see Bhutan as the meeting point and the melting point of Asia's oldest and greatest civilizations, the Indic civilization to the south and the Sino-Tibetan civilization to the north. And these valleys, like Paro, a photo taken by Michael in 1960s, and Bumthang, also by Michael, they were these very comfortable corridors and trade routes for the cultural fusion between Tibet and India. And the kind of Buddhism that Bhutan received initially from India, but largely later from Tibet, is also one that is the most advanced, complex form of Buddhism, having all the three major strands of early mainstream Buddhism based on monasticism and renunciation, and then the Mahayana component, the culture of promoting compassion and wisdom, which started around the beginning of the Common Era, and then the Tantric form, which developed in the middle of the first millennium, a syncretic development. And by the time Buddhism reached places like Bhutan and Tibet, all these three main phases in India have occurred, that we received a very complex and sophisticated Buddhist tradition. So these basically would be the second reason why Bhutan's cultural composition is colorful, complex, and often confusing for a first-time visitor. Now, unlike many of our neighbors, Bhutan has enjoyed an unusual cultural continuity. To the south, India has gone through major cultural changes 1,000 years ago through Islamic invasions. and then 500 years ago through British colonization, and then a haphazard modernization in the 20th century. To the north, China and Tibet went through major changes during the spread of communism, and then through the tragic Cultural Revolution, which almost wiped out their past. In contrast to these neighboring places, Bhutan has enjoyed very special cultural continuity with no colonization, no internal upheavals, no major natural calamities. So it's mainly, and this is mainly due to the geographic isolation and the difficulty to access, that Bhutan remained a country that saw modernization come late, and equally also much less academic study. Before the 21st century, it was mainly the Aris brothers through whom Bhutan was known to the outside world. And it was Michael who extensively wrote about Bhutan, and Anthony Aris who published works on Bhutan. There were only a handful of researchers working on Bhutan, including old friends like Phuntsok, Yoshiro Imaida, and John Adusi. However, like many aspects of life in Bhutan, scholarship in Bhutan has also begun to change in the recent years. In the last 60 years or so, Bhutan has gone through a tremendous process of change through modernization, which the country actively sought, and globalization, which came with such great speed and intensity. So today, when people ask me to describe Bhutan in one word, I normally say transition. And I would like to illustrate that through a few points. Firstly, Bhutan went from an isolated hermitic country to become a member of the global meld. Now, this is a very common proverb that I heard when I grew up in my village, Jaza Name Thama. Jaza is the end of sky. My village, Ura, is on the eastern edge of Bumthang, and Jaza is on the western edge of Bumthang. Most people in my village never traveled out of the Bumthang district and considered Jaza as the end of sky. You have traveled so far to Jaza, the end of sky, was a regular expression. In 2018, I discovered I have more first cousins in New York City than anywhere else in the world. So this is how a very isolated country that saw Jaza as the end of sky has exploded to become a member of a full global community. Today, not only are Bhutanese traveling abroad and living abroad, there are also many visitors from outside coming to Bhutan. And then television and internet, which were introduced in 1999, has spread across the country. And internet and television brought the outside world tumbling into the living rooms and the individual lives. Now, smartphones and social media has penetrated even in the most remote corners of Bhutan with nationwide fiber optic network and almost 100% coverage of telecommunication facilities. Starlink has arrived in Bhutan just a year ago. Even illiterate grannies, they are busy using WeChat and WhatsApp. And one recent report on ChatGPT, Bhutan ranked top with approximately 15.96 of its population using the AI tool. Thimphu, as a capital, was just a dzong with few farmhouses around it. Bhutan had not a single street. Bhutan was an entirely rural community 60 years ago. Today, almost 50% of the population live in new urban settlements. And when you move from a rural community with very well-developed community support systems to a new urban environment, there are many challenges. We estimate around 20% of the population may have been literate. The vast majority, we don't have data, but around 80% would have transmitted their values, principles, knowledge, and skills orally. This has changed with modern education. Literacy has risen now to almost 80%, but before the literary culture got well established, the audiovisual world came in with such force that one could say Bhutan went from an oral past directly to the audiovisual and digital present. Economically, Bhutan was a subsistence farming community, and today we have moved from that to a consumer's market economy. Agricultural productivity has gone down. We have become more import dependent, that so much so that we import about 60% of the rice we eat. 60 years ago, salt may be the only basic commodity we had to import from outside. And this kind of shift has, again, severe consequences, such as import dependency, food insecurity, and trade deficit. Politically, Bhutan has moved from a medieval monarchy to a multi-party democracy and constitutional monarchy only in 2008. But as a cultural scholar, the most far-reaching change I see is in the inner minds of the people, the intangible cultures, the worldviews, mindset, and the value systems. The two building blocks of Bhutanese traditional culture were our pre-Buddhist belief system, that is shamanistic and animistic, and the mind-centered Buddhist system. In the pre-Buddhist belief system, you have this regard for nature, seeing mountains, abodes of mountain deities, river spirits, lake spirits, forest guardians, and so forth, seeing the whole environment as a living force, and how human life was a constant negotiation with these natural forces to maintain harmony, to have a harmonious relationship. And it's thanks to such belief system, I suppose, that Bhutan has been able to champion the cause of environment conservation and has become acclaimed as the first carbon negative country in the world. The second building block of the traditional Buddhist culture is really the mind-centered Buddhist outlook that we got since the 8th century. Seeing mind as the primary ingredient of happiness, Buddhism brought a way to look at the world and existence through the lens of the mind, and to understand the ordinary state of the human spirit and consciousness, to transform it to a better one from an ordinary sentient being's consciousness to an enlightened spirit of the Buddha. So these two traditional sort of components of the Bhutanese worldview inform the traditional ethos of life. But today, to these two, one may add a third layer, a third component, and that is the modern secular scientific worldview that we got through modernization, through globalization, and mainly through our mainstream school education. If you, for instance, ask my father where he is in terms of his position in the world, he would say, I'm in the holy district of Bumthang in the glorious Kingdom of Bhutan, south of Tibet and north of Bodh Gaya, which is the epicenter of the southern continent. But if I ask the same question to my nephews and nieces, it would be, I'm from landlocked country sandwiched between India and China. So you see a vast shift in terms of how they position themselves. You see, in fact, two Bhutans, where you have the traditional Bhutan speaking local languages, living mostly in villages, following spirituality, and passing down knowledge and values in oral forms, and an urban Bhutan that's secular, using English as a main medium of reading and writing, and mostly based in the towns. Now, these kind of changes have, of course, the process of modernization and changes have also brought good benefit to Bhutan. One cannot deny that infant mortality rate, for instance, which was around 21% 60 years ago, has now been brought down to 1.5%, on par with developed economies. You have life expectancy going up from about 35 to 75 now. You have safe drinking water and electricity reaching almost all the homes. So there has been a lot of positive developments, especially in the improvement of living standards. Even in the case of people doing academic work, in the last 60 years, or last 20 years at least, we have seen major developments. There were 16 PhDs before 2000, out of which 6 were Bhutanese. And since then, there are 209 PhDs, mostly coming out of Australia. Now add to this the number of people doing masters. Human resources for research and development in Bhutan has definitely increased. And this positive development may be the fulfillment of Michael's aspiration for Bhutan, which is, I quote, to produce scholars who combine knowledge and appreciation of its traditional heritage with new perspectives and methodologies of our own age. Yet such rapid and sweeping changes have a lot of problems, besides economic issues like import dependence or high public debt, rising cost of living, and so forth. There's, above all, a growing case of stress, apprehension, and confusion, which often becomes manifest through social ills such as substance abuse, depression, and suicide, with about 100 young people taking their own lives each year. In midst of such chaotic change and confusion, one needs then a developmental compass to find a sense of direction, and this came in the form of gross national happiness from the fourth king, who in the 1970s declared that Bhutan's gross national happiness is more important than gross national product, in response to a journalist who asked for Bhutan's GNP figures. The fourth king crystallized in this term, gross national happiness, the Bhutanese ethos of happiness and harmony, which remained diffuse in society. And he ruled the country in this spirit, reminding his people that modernization should not be conflated with westernization. He became a champion of environment conservation and of Bhutan's culture and its spiritual traditions. However, not much was said about GNH until 1990s, late 90s. Not much was said in 1980s when I was at school, for instance. It was towards the end of the 21st century that our first Prime Minister, Jigme Waitille, officially formulated GNH as the development goal of Bhutan, with 4 pillars of socio-economic development, good governance, culture preservation, and environment conservation. And they also, around that time, coined a Bhutanese term to render GNH, Jelyong Kaki Pelsom. I remember going back in 2000 to Bhutan, and even senior ex-bureaucrats and ministers asking me what this is. Is this a government office? I hear that there was a radio journalist who went around the country asking people what they thought of Jelyong Kaki Pelsom. And a retired soldier said, "I've heard of her. She seems beautiful, but I haven't seen her yet." Now that is because Gaki is a very popular girl's name, and so is Pelsom. So most people didn't really have an idea of GNH, although they lived GNH as an experience. But since then, there's been very robust promotion within the country, and now most people know what it is. But more importantly, Bhutan managed to place happiness on a global development agenda, and in 2012, Bhutan successfully campaigned to establish 20th March as the International Day of Happiness through a UN General Assembly resolution. The Center for GNH Bhutan and GNH Studies, a government think tank, which has been tasked to formulate and operationalize GNH, then took this further in the past 2 decades to break down the 4 pillars into 9 domains, which you see here on the screen. Education, health, living standards, good governance, culture, diversity and resilience, psychological well-being, community vitality, time use, and ecological diversity and resilience. They came up with 33 indicators and 124 variables to measure happiness, and dividing people into 4 sets of those below 50%, between 50 to 66, and 7 to 76, and then 77 and above, describing them as narrowly happy, unhappy, narrowly happy, extensively happy, and deeply happy. They have conducted several surveys, 3 major surveys in 2010, 2015, and 2022. And here you see how 40.9% of Bhutanese were happy in 2010, and then 43.4% in 2015, and 48.1% in 2022. Now, if you imagine 0 to represent all Bhutanese being always unhappy, and 1, all Bhutanese being always happy, Bhutan was at 0.74 in 2010, 0.75 in 2015, and 0.78 in 2022. Now, Even in this endeavor of formulating the GNH index, Oxford has made its share of contribution. Tashukarma Ura, the main thinker behind this, is an alumnus of Oxford. And the GNH survey results and data were analyzed and aggregated using the methodology for multidimensional poverty proposed by Professor Sabina Alkhair and Professor James Foster of Oxford Poverty and Human Development Institute. Now, one must note that this is a bit different from the World Happiness Report, which ranked Bhutan 95 out of 156 countries in 2018, and since then had not even included Bhutan. But it was Bhutan's campaign that led also to the publication of the World Happiness Report by Oxford, the Oxford Wellbeing Research Center. Now, in pursuing gross national happiness, the Bhutanese government took a very cautious and measured approach to development with due regard to environment, culture, and human well-being as a whole. This approach is reflected in the national policies such as the high-value, low-volume tourism policy, the commitment to keep 60% of the country under forest cover for perpetuity, and 52% as protected areas, and also architectural rules requiring Bhutanese traditional designs and so forth. But in the meantime, digital revolution, which swept across the globe, began to have its share of influence on the Bhutanese population, particularly its youth, who make some 60%. Young Bhutanese could easily see life and opportunities in developed countries in real time. This led to a rise in expectation, which a small and poor economy like Bhutan's could not meet. Bhutan's economic development has not, and perhaps couldn't have, grown commensurate with the rise of exposure and expectations. In 1999, the government published a book called Bhutan 2020, setting the vision for 20 years, and set about 100 milestones to achieve, out of which 13 were not achieved on time, and most of them were with regard to the economy, such as the installed capacity for hydropower generation, for agriculture production, and so forth. So while education, which was successful at least in terms of quantity, produced many young school and college graduates who joined the workforce, the job market did not expand proportionately, leading to a serious problem of youth unemployment, which still looms at around 17%. So faced with such gainful and lack of gainful and meaningful employment at home and the option of seeking better opportunities abroad, Bhutanese youth began to immigrate in droves to places like Australia, Canada, Middle East, Japan, and India. And this is a picture of young people queuing early in the morning for an IELTS test, and families saying goodbye to those who were emigrating for work. So instead of reaping the demographic dividend, as we expected, Bhutan turned into a supplier of English-speaking, docile, hardworking labor force for countries such as Australia and Canada. Even in the UK, the number has increased drastically from about a couple dozen 15 years ago to now about 600 students studying here. So to counter these various economic challenges at home and the persistent emigration of productive citizens, Bhutan is now taking a new approach to development under the leadership of the fifth king, who is himself an alumnus of this university. While remaining rooted in the traditional value system and the pursuit of GNH, which His Majesty the fifth king describes as development with values, Bhutan has today adopted a forward-looking, nimble, bold, and risk-taking approach, acutely aware that Bhutan's living standards and quality of life has to improve to reach a higher level on par with developed countries to retain the young workforce and bring back those who have left. There is a move to expedite the economic productivity by tenfold and take Bhutan to a high income level by 2050. To this effect, Bhutan today is embracing cutting-edge technology, as is demonstrated by its successful investment in Bitcoin, only fourth after the US, China, UK, and Ukraine. And its adoption of national digital identity based on blockchain technology to deliver all public services, and crypto transactions for tourism, and the establishment of the first fully reserve digital bank. But by far the most significant of the new development and a new movement is the project of Gellifu Mindfulness City, a special administrative zone covering 2,600 square kilometers, nearly 7% of Bhutan's landmass. With its separate executive, legislative, and judiciary systems, His Majesty, led by His Majesty, this autonomous entity within Bhutan has already adopted Singapore's laws for corporate, commercial, and company governance matters, and Abu Dhabi global market regulations for financial services. Now, let's imagine having an opportunity to build a new city. What kind of environment, architecture, community facilities, economy, governance would one choose? Gellifu Mindfulness City is a vision to build such a futuristic city. One which is environmentally sustainable, economically prosperous, and spiritually peaceful and enlightening. With the visionary and entrepreneurial king at its helm, the Gellifu Mindfulness Project adopts a sandboxing approach to experiment a bold idea, to try out innovative policies and practices in a limited area, and then gradually roll out to the rest of the country in what the king calls the diamond strategy. So in taking up these new projects, the king is set on a mission to change the mindset of the youth by rethinking one's identity from a small, landlocked, vulnerable country to a new generation of bold, young nation ready to do business, on a mission to reframe Bhutan's geopolitical situation from a country caught between two large neighbors to an economic hub and a commercial gateway, just as Bhutan was a cultural corridor in the past. So this royal vision and the initiative to build a city which is mindful, prosperous, and sustainable, taking advantage of Bhutan's green energy, communal solidarity, cooperative citizenry, and above all, visionary leadership, is today the most happening thing in Bhutan. And there's evidently an open invitation for all of you to come and take part in it, to invest in it. But I couldn't possibly end this presentation without sharing a bit about the Loden Foundation, which was started here in Oxford in 1999. I would always wanted to do something out of my Buddhist education and faith to help people in Asia generally and Bhutan in particular. And that opportunity came in 1999 when Robert Miles, who was the head porter of Balliol College, shared that he had financial difficulty to finish school and would want to help a child who may also face similar difficulties. And he could afford £50. We took those £50 to our village headmaster, village school headmaster, who then said this could be used to support Tenzin Pelmo, a 6-year-old girl from a family of 7 sisters. And this is how we started this sponsorship program. Anthony Marilaw, Elizabeth Chatwin, and many others joined later to then formalize the channel and found the Loden Foundation. And since then, we have started the early learning centers, 3 of them, because in those days there were only commercial daycare centers in Thimphu and none outside of Thimphu. Then we went on to also fund university scholarships, especially in areas where Bhutan stands in need of human resources. And we do hope that in the future we'll be able to fund few students also to go to Oxford. We have also been promoting entrepreneurship in the tertiary educational institutions and conducting public education programs, mainly through Bhutan Dialogues, a series we started in collaboration with the UN to discuss policies and development. So overall, the first program we have is one of education, as Loden is an educational charity. We have had 860 children pass out of the preschool, some 230 funded to go to school and finish school education, and 110 university scholarships so far, and 69 sessions of public education program. The second program we have is youth entrepreneurship, particularly social entrepreneurship, which started with support from 2 of my French friends, Anne and Gerard Tardy. What we do is we conduct trainings and motivational sessions to encourage young people to come up with ideas, then give them soft loans to start businesses, support them with mentoring and monitoring, and build a network of social entrepreneurs. Recently, out of the 320 startups we supported, many of them have the capacity to accelerate and scale up. So we have launched our new Center for Social Ventures and Acceleration program. So altogether, we have 320 startups that we have funded, over 5,700 that we have trained, and through them, some 860 jobs created, and we cover the whole country, all districts in the country. The third project came about because of my own experience and my own work here in the British Library, the Bodleian and Cambridge UL Library, digitizing and researching on the Young Husband collection, which inspired me to look at Bhutan's archives, and our colleagues Rob Mayer and Kathy asked me to get a copy of some rare texts, and that again reinforced my wish to go and digitize Bhutanese archives, which are otherwise often endangered by temple fires or theft or earthquakes. And so we have been carrying out textual digitization. Then we also carried out audiovisual documentation of oral cultures, intangible cultural traditions. So altogether, so far we have done 75 archives containing about 5 million pages of manuscripts, and published 7 books regarding culture. We've also got about 3,000 hours of audiovisual recordings of Bhutan's intangible and oral traditions. So that is in gist what we have been doing through the Loden Foundation. Now, to conclude, as I know, one of the things that I also want to share very briefly is this Center for Study and Contemplation that I've established in Thimphu, using my own resources, and also the work I'm doing in my village. I went with Mary-Law and Anthony Aris in 2000 back to the village festival, and since then I've been going every year, trying to keep the festival going because it serves as a very important cultural cement, social cement, to bring together the community and pass down the cultural practices from the elders to the younger generation. So today I'm involved in replacing this old shack, which is the spectators gallery, and building a new one. And you are most welcome to this festival, which will happen at the end of April for next year. And it roughly coincides with Easter generally. So now you might get a very deep sense of peace, tranquility, and security from pictures like this one of my village. But in reality, we live in an era of tumultuous change and unpredictable future. In a period of just 4 years, 3 governments in Bhutan's neighborhood have been toppled by political unrest. The world we inhabit is clearly in a VUCA state, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. Even remote places like Bhutan are not spared. Climate change, demographic shifts, and economic issues pose serious challenges. Bhutan's story of modernization and its efforts to cope with these challenges began with a cautious and measured approach. Yet it is now adopting a more entrepreneurial, proactive, nimble, and mindful one. I would say the story of Bhutan's development is not a straightforward one, neither one of proven success nor of failure. It's an unfolding story. Bhutan is not only a meeting point of 2 of Asia's greatest civilizations as it was in the past. It is today an exemplary case of rapid convergence of raw tradition of the East with the modernity of the West. Ideologically, it is neither on the conservative right nor on the liberal left. It carries strong vestiges of feudalistic tendencies from the past, but strives to promote a socialist-type welfare state, while also witnessing a capitalistic trend resulting in more disparity between haves and have-nots. Its system is marked by a very strong monarchical influence as well as a growing democratic fervor, and by traditional symbols and rituals as much as by modern spirit of creativity. As innovative as it may be, it's not a case of a tabula rasa, a blank slate on which to write only new things. It's a tricky balancing act of keeping the old and embracing the new, fulfilling internal needs and meeting external demands, catering to youthful ambitions as well as to age-old wisdom. No nation is perhaps putting more effort into juggling the multiple factors of holistic human development as Bhutan is doing today. And it is this tendency, being cautious and bold at the same time, nimble yet mindful, forward-looking and yet deeply rooted in traditional values, right from the top leadership, that is the strength of Bhutan. In being a latecomer to modernity, Bhutan had the opportunity and advantage to assess and rethink the course of human development, to re-examine the prevailing mindset and normative social and economic behavior, and to seek a better alternative. In gross national happiness, Bhutan offered an alternative economic paradigm beyond just the measurement of GDP. And in Gelipu Mindfulness City, it is once again offering a new design and purpose for urban living. The journey Bhutan is going through is a colorful, complex, and often paradoxical one, like its traditional culture. Bhutan is at an inflection point, as His Majesty the Fifth King puts it. It stands at a junction between the past and the future, between the old and the new. As we say in a local proverb, Lamage lapse gu, chumage sampe bu. On a pass yet to cross the mountain, on a bridge yet to cross the river. The question, however, is not about to cross or not to cross. It's about how to cross and how to evolve, because evolution is no longer a choice. So the next couple decades will show whether Bhutan can successfully become a model of sustainable and holistic development and succumb to the forces of globalization and usual materialistic pursuit of money and power, even at the expense of our shared planet. The successful story of Bhutan can be a hope for humanity. In its unfolding story, we shall witness not only the destiny of a small, distant kingdom, but the possibility of a different trajectory for humanity, a better version of the world, a world with enduring sense of peace, prosperity, and fulfillment, a world where economic development goes hand in hand with environment conservation, where inner spiritual well-being is sought after as much as external material comfort, and a world where wisdom of the past informs the prospects of the future. And I would like to end by reflecting again on the importance of connections and relationships, on how one country, particularly a small one, cannot work alone in forging such a future, let alone become an example to the rest of the world. Bhutan in general, and the modest effort we make through the Loden Foundation in particular, will depend on the goodwill and support of many friends around the world, as was in the past, and not the least on people from this beautiful city and wonderful university, which has a very long-standing and special relationship to Bhutan, a special ladle connection. And it has been a privilege for me to be part of this special connection. And this meeting, celebrating 25 years of Aris Trust and 10 years of Aris Lecture, is a reinforcement of this special lateral connection. So I want to thank you from the depth of my heart for inviting me to this lecture, Ulrike and Wolfson, and all of you for coming this evening. Thank you very much. Gadinche.
A very big thank you to Lopen Phuntsho for this insightful lecture, for sharing both the challenges and also the really fascinating developments and attempts to make the world a better place, starting in Bhutan. And also sharing what the Loden Foundation is doing. I know that Lopen Karma Phuntsho has brought some leaflets of the Loden Foundation, which you will find in the buttery afterwards where we have the drinks. So if you like, please take them home. You will get some more information and we'll also see how you can support the foundation. It's customary after these big named lectures at Wolfson not to have a question and answer session. However, I'm sure there are lots of questions and you would love to discuss this further with Lopen Karma Phuntsho. You will have the opportunity to do that later in the buttery when we have drinks and food. So there will be plenty of opportunity to continue the conversation then. And I think listening to you, how rapid these developments are, I think we need to invite you back in 10 years' time for the 20th Aris lecture, just really to hear how the story has evolved further. So again, a very big thank you. Now, we come to the second item in the program, and that is the 25-year anniversary of Tibetan and Himalayan studies at the University of Oxford. And we thought that on this occasion it would be nice to reflect on this whole long trajectory from the 1970s when Michael started teaching at Oxford to the year 2000 when Charles Ramble was appointed as the first post holder in Tibetan and Himalayan studies. And then finally also to current times and our current group of students and researchers in Oxford. And I've therefore invited 4 speakers who can speak to these different periods. And I thought we should do that in chronological order. And therefore the first speaker will have to be Charles Ramble, who completed his doctorate here in 1985, followed by Jill Sudbury, who received her doctorate in 2007-2008. Then Paddy Booz, who completed his doctorate in 2011. And finally, we'll hear from Richard Chang, who is one of the current doctoral students and started his doctorate just last year in 2024. And so I won't do any big ceremony around this or introductions. You're just invited to come to the floor. I won't intervene, and I will leave the floor to you. Charles, please, could you come to the front?
I'd like to begin by thanking Ulrike for asking me to say a few words on this very auspicious occasion, and also for giving me this opportunity to catch up with many friends who are here today, some from as far away as Cambridge. Among those I've known for the longest is today's speaker, Karma Phuntsok himself, an international figure who remains solidly rooted in his Payul, his native land of Bhutan. It occurred to me that there is a certain historical felicity in the two of us being here today at this annual event to honor Michael Aris, to the extent that I was Michael's first doctoral student in 1979, and Karma was his last, at the time he passed away in 1999, which somehow makes the two of us the bookends to the 20 years of Michael's supervisory activity in Oxford. The numerous tributaries that have fed into the mainstream of Tibetology include the study of the Tibetan language as a means of obtaining access to the Buddhist scriptures that were translated from their vanished Sanskrit originals, and, later, of reading the commentaries to those works by Tibetan scholars. It was this tradition that was taken as the foundation of Tibetology in most universities in Europe and North America, with a few notable exceptions. And if Tibetology has become more independent now from its Indological roots, Buddhism nevertheless remains its center of gravity today. Michael's own brand of Tibetology was different. When I arrived in Oxford in 1979, he was putting the final touches to his first book, An Early History of Bhutan, a country where he had just been living for 6 years as tutor to the royal family. Michael was, of course, a historian who was more interested in the dynamics of state formation than in the intricacies of doctrine. When I was faced with the very enjoyable challenge of designing the MPhil and other courses in Tibetan and Himalayan studies after becoming the post holder in 2000, I opted not to put Buddhism at the center of it. My experience of Tibetan society had been primarily as an anthropologist living in a Tibetan-speaking village in the Himalayas, rather than, as is often the case, a scholar of religious studies working with educated monks in the exile community. This wasn't just a matter of making a virtue out of a necessity, but rather the fact that there were so many other aspects of Tibetan society that it seemed to me were not usually given the prominence they deserved. This choice came as a cause of some bewilderment to some of my early students who had some familiarity with the exile religious community in India. One of these suggested that it was impossible to broach Tibetology without learning the essentials, and proceeded to demonstrate to the class, in my small office, how one should perform full-length prostrations. Not to me, I might add. One of the two people in my first cohort of MPhil students abandoned his degree after 6 months on the grounds that the course didn't contain enough philosophy. I reminded him that I'd told him at the outset that I wouldn't be teaching any philosophy at all, and he replied that he hadn't believed that I could possibly have meant it. It seemed to me that I could focus on other aspects of Tibetan civilization: kinship, sacred landscape, social history, and the politics of religious institutions, such as reincarnation, because Buddhism, both in Oxford and elsewhere, was in safe hands. I could leave that to eminently more qualified specialists, such as Richard Gombrich, Rob and Kathy, Karma himself, who gave a series of lectures at Balliol, as well as Ulrike in her first incarnation here, and then the successive holders of the newly established chair of Buddhist studies. With Ulrike's very steady hand on the helm for the past 15 years, Tibetan studies has clearly flourished. In view of her own background, Buddhism naturally has a more important place than it had in the past. But having been the external examiner for a few years, I've been able to see from the exam papers that a wide range of subjects is being represented. Apart from Ulrike's other interests in biography and narrative, for example, within the Ames faculty, we have Lama Jab's work in modern and contemporary literature, and elsewhere in the university, there is Claire Harris's work in the visual arts, and now Nanda Piri's new project on Tibetan law, a very welcome development, with all these components working seamlessly with colleagues based more squarely in the Cis-Himalayan region, such as David Gellner and Sondra Hausner. In Paris, I have to say, we're similarly blessed with a number of close colleagues specializing in quite different domains of Tibetan studies, and I'm delighted to see 3 of them here today. Marta Cernesi, who has a wonderful collaborative project with Ulrike on the subject of the Tibetan Chidar period. Alice Travers, who has almost single-handedly brought to light the history and even the very existence of the Tibetan army, and a pioneer in the application of artificial intelligence to understanding Tibetan manuscripts, Rachel Griffiths, now of our parish. The fact that Tibetology is flourishing in Oxford and in Paris shouldn't make us complacent. The last 25 years have also seen several Tibetan positions in Europe and Asia axed or redefined. This and the increasing pressure on European institutions from certain international quarters with regard to what we can and can't say about Tibet, and even our very use of the name Tibet, are a real cause for concern. Tibetan is sometimes referred to as a small subject. In fact, there are no small subjects, only subjects that are under-resourced in relation to the multiple avenues of research and the wealth of unexplored resources they offer, and Tibetan is one of these. This means that we have to punch above our weight to give this extraordinary diversity due prominence, not allowing it to be pushed around or sidelined, and this is something we can do by using Tibetan materials for advances in area non-specific domains of research, such as anthropology, comparative religion, literary theory, and natural language processing, to give just a few examples. A parallel problem the subject is facing is the decline in student intake in certain departments of Tibetan studies, something that may be due in part to the shine wearing off a certain image of Tibet that made it attractive to past generations. It's up to us to challenge this trend by showing the full range of what makes Tibetan civilization endlessly fascinating and how rewarding it can be to engage with its many facets. That, I think, is exactly what you have been doing here in Oxford, and that's why the field is continuing to flourish here. After working so long and hard to establish Tibetan and Himalayan studies in Oxford, I think Michael would be entitled to a glow of satisfaction if he were to see the fruition of his efforts 25 years after its foundation. Thank you.
My goodness, it's such an honour to be here tonight. Our main speaker tonight, in his wonderful obituary of Anthony, drew attention to the often overlooked role of the publisher. And I would like to shed a little light on Anthony's singular contribution to Tibetan and Himalayan studies. My first career was in publishing. I was introduced to the Tibetan world by one of our colleagues, our picture researcher, the wonderful, albeit rather formidable, Marilyn Thorold. One day, Marilyn announced that Anthony Aris had invited us to lunch. On the day, I remember we were running rather late. I was in charge of navigation, juggling a London A to Z on my lap as we zipped through the streets of West London, and as I remember, at least 2 bottles of wine clanking in the footwell. Anthony, Marilyn proclaimed from the driver's seat, has the most wonderful eye. Over the years, I came to know what she meant. Miraculously, we arrived on time. Anthony was the most generous of hosts. We were ushered into the elegant home that he created with Marie-Laure, filled with beautiful textiles and objects from various parts of the Himalayan region, especially from Bhutan. Our conversation ranged over photographic archives and their reproduction costs, the layout of books. He got rather cross about issues to do with margins, various new acquisitions of Tibetan texts by institutions such as the British Library. Michael's name looped through this conversation, and a new publication that he was working on. He gestured expansively towards large bundles of page proofs in the corner of his office and groaned rather dramatically. These were the colour separations for Tibetan medical paintings, one of the most iconic texts that was published by Serindia. In the space of a few hours, we had covered aspects of publishing that would normally be covered by a wide range of departments in a larger publishing house: production, rights, editorial, distribution, marketing, warehousing, etc. Such is the life of a small publisher. Anthony's introduction to publishing had been as a bookseller. Bookselling's a tough gig. Our company had a policy of sending new members of staff out with the sales reps. We would disappear into the little rooms at the back of bookshops and freeze in school and college staff rooms. I found it slightly terrifying and endlessly fascinating. Here we would see books as commodities, lines on financial spreadsheets. Not only were we persuading potential customers of our wares and bookshops to stock our books, but we were also getting feedback along with that grist of the publishing world: gossip. All of this was fed back into information about print runs and reprints, gaps in the market, rumours about competing texts and so forth. When Anthony founded Serindia Publications in 1976, at the improbably young age of 30, he knew he was entering into a niche market, but he knew both the niche and the market very well indeed. He knew he had to be very strategic and commercially savvy, and he had to use his connections wisely. As we now look upon shelves of books groaning about shelves are groaning with books about Tibet and the Himalayan region. It's hard to remember that this wasn't always the case. Back in the day, most of us returned from our travels with our rucksacks full of books that we would struggle to obtain in the UK. They were often cheaply produced with photographic plates that were illegible and spines that soon collapsed. Sir India not only began to fill that gap, but did so with the highest production values. Anthony's books were beautiful. He set the bar high. A subtle dance takes place when we add text and images to a blank page. Not only should it look aesthetically pleasing, but the reader's eye needs to engage with that text. We need to encourage the reader to turn the page and to want to buy that book and persuade other people to buy that book. It is ultimately a commodity. Anthony paid minute attention to illustrations. In the pre-digital age, this involved laborious colour separations and proofing. He was competing with the big publishers who could command large print runs and the subsequent economies of scale. But Anthony knew his market and he had his own contacts. Books such as Tibetan medical paintings were exemplary of that. I would particularly like to draw attention to Anthony's use of colour. Anthony was not afraid of bold colours, but he also worked with the most delicate of palettes. In so many ways, this reflected the natural dyes that infused the traditional Tibetan and Himalayan world that was so prominent in the beautiful handcrafts that filled the Aris home. It was a subtle cultural translation. Small independent publishers like Anthony and Sir India are the outliers of the publishing world, but have a very important role to play in both publishing and, in this instance, academia. Independent publishers, and I've met quite a few now, tend to be singular in their vision, with a deep passion and knowledge of their field and the people in it. Sometimes they're also ever so slightly eccentric. Their independence means that they can trust their gut and publish with a commercial awareness that that book will be exactly what is needed. We were very lucky that Anthony was our outlier. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Excuse me. I just feel, I feel that Michael and Anthony are very close and with us right now. I'm going to begin with words straight from the horse's mouth, a letter that Anthony wrote in May of 2000. Dear Paddy, there is much good news to celebrate, and I very much hope that you can join us for the reception and concert in Michael's memory. As you may know, this trust, the Michael Aris Memorial Trust for Tibetan and Himalayan Studies, was formed last year after the death of my twin brother. Not only to fulfill his wish for a permanent university base in this country for Tibetan and Himalayan studies, but also thereby to honor his life and his academic legacy. Thanks to very, very generous benefactions pledged even before Michael died, we have, as a start, been able to endow in perpetuity the new post of university lectureship in Tibetan and Himalayan studies. I am now pleased to inform you that Dr. Charles Ramble has been appointed to take up this post in October this year. So that was 25 years and 1 month ago. Remarkable. I'm going to be a little bit perhaps more personal here in that I had the great good fortune and great blessing to actually have lived with Michael and with Anthony at various times in my life. And that the two of them, those brothers, they helped me in 100 different ways, and they certainly changed my life forever. I first met Michael in 1991. This was in Cambridge, Massachusetts in the United States, I found myself in Cambridge, and through the grapevine, I learned that there were two people there who had strong and long ties with Tibet and the Himalayas. Michael was a visiting professor at Harvard University, and the second person was a gentleman named Terrace Moore, who was a great mountaineer in the 1930s. He was probably the preeminent American mountaineer. And in 1932, he and three others climbed a magnificent and stupendous mountain in East Tibet called Minya Konka. It's a mountain over 7,500 meters, around just under 25,000 feet. And as people did in those days, they gathered souvenirs and objects to bring back with them. And I introduced myself to Terrace Moore, and he showed me these objects from East Tibet from 1932. And the prime object, he didn't know what it was. Well, it was a Tibetan pecha. Okay, this is a Tibetan book, which is dozens or hundreds of loose leaves inside pressed wooden boards wrapped in silk. He had no idea what this was. And I thought, aha, I think there's a gentleman here who might be able to figure this out. And so I picked up this great pecha and I walked through the streets of Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I found Michael in his office. Briefly introduced, he took off the silk, looked at it, and in about 10 seconds he looked up and said, aha, this is the autobiography of the fifth Dalai Lama. And so this was the beginning of my friendship with Michael, which happened to coincide in 1991 in the month of October with the announcement that his wife, Sue, had won the Nobel Peace Prize. Michael's life was immediately overwhelmed. He became astoundingly busy. He had to deal with bureaucrats, with governments, with journalists, with endless phone calls. And so he turned to me and said, Paddy, would you like to help? And so he hired me. So I became a kind of, I would say, kind of like ecclesiastical secretary, where I handled everything. I did his shopping, I did his cooking, I did his cleaning. I answered the phone, I made his appointments. But in this way, we grew very close, and we were also working on a book together at the time. It was a book of photographs of the Austrian-American explorer, linguist, all-round man named Joseph Rock. And Michael and I were gathering all of this material to make a book in the midst of this incredible tornado of activity around his wife. The remarkable thing is that Michael could do so many things at once. He had this amazing ability to concentrate, but he kept postponing writing the chief essay for this book, the main essay. And finally, the deadline was there, and it's 2 a.m, and Michael did not use profanity. Michael did not swear, as far as I know, but he went so far as to say damn that night. And at 2 a.m., it was as though he sat down and he was a funnel to the universe, and he just sat and wrote. And it was a near perfect essay, which I was able to read the next day. Remarkable. Michael introduced me to Anthony in London about a year or so later at the home of their mother, Josette, in South Kensington, I think. Is that where she lived? And immediately I saw these two brothers so alike and yet so different. They were two very, very different men. Anthony immediately saw that I might be helpful in the book business, and one thing led to another, and I became an editor for Anthony and worked with him many, many years in that capacity, and was always amazed at the skill and the just the wonderful aura that Antony brought to the publishing business. He would get dozens and dozens and dozens of recommendations for books, but he carefully sifted them, and every year would only publish 2 or 3 or 4 books. Okay, and these, of course, are among some of the most wonderful and spectacular manuscripts, real masterpieces. We can talk about Secret Visions of the Fifth Dalai Lama, about Tibetan medical paintings, the books of Roberto Vitali, and on and on. And Antony rarely made a mistake. He understood books. Occasionally, he said, oh, that one, it sank like a stone. But there were not many of those. Coming back a moment to Tibetan studies, many of you will remember in 2003, there was the IATS conference, the International Association of Tibetan Studies conference at St. Hugh's College in 2003. And I was simply there as an observer, perhaps thinking I could pick up some editing jobs. And during one lunch across the great lawn there, I heard this voice, "Paddy, time for you to learn about Tibet." And Antony had already plotted out my future. And he pressed me, he made sure that I came here. And so it was like the voice of an Old Testament prophet saying that you, young man, have to come. And so that's how I ended up coming here in 2004, was here 2004 to 2006. And of course, we could talk endlessly about what actually happened to us students then. It was a wonderful, wonderful atmosphere. There was the creation of this term called the Tibetan Core, which was a group that sort of held together, and I think many of the Tibetan Core are here today, as a sort of an indirect outcome of all of this too was with Tim Myatt and Brandon Dotson, the resuscitation of the eyesight, that is the International Seminar of Young Tibetologists, which got going, I think, around 2006, 2007. And at the time, I could definitely confirm that I was the oldest young Tibetologist. I think I'd like to just close by saying that, Michael and Antony were both just outstanding, big-hearted people. They cared tremendously about people. They cared that there was peace amongst people. Antony was famous as a peacemaker. There would be trouble inevitably in publishing or between personalities, and Antony tried his hardest to bring them together. It's not always easy to go a little bit deeper into what a person's beliefs are, but I got hints at this. I was fishing a little bit on what Michael's beliefs were, on what he had learned from living in Bhutan. And he wasn't uncomfortable, but he sort of looked around and said, well, I think you perhaps might say I'm on the path, or that I could be considered a pratekya Buddha. Okay, a pratekya Buddha, that is a Buddha unto himself, a Buddha who finds enlightenment on his own. And I think that's quite fitting for Michael. And with Antony, there was an incident I'll always remember at the house in Putney. We were going out to lunch. Antony opens the door, and there's a derelict, homeless person lying right there in the entranceway. Antony, he looks up to heaven and says, "There, but for the grace of God, go I." Yeah, and then he helped this man and gave him £5. Yeah, so I would say that Michael and Antony both had a profound effect on me. I love them dearly, and I feel that they're still very, very close. Thank you.
Fall of 2022 was when I first moved my life to this old English town of Oxford. In this unfamiliar land, the Tibetan Himalayan Study Center was the first group of people that I got close to. There were 5 of us in our MPhil cohort, and the group doesn't get too much bigger if we also include the DPhils, the postdocs, and some of the visiting scholars who are attending the Tibetan classes. However, it was particularly because of how tightly knitted our cohort was that I had one of the most excellent learning times in my life. From Tibetan language classes to lectures about Tibetan and Himalayan history, and also literary culture, under the kind and gentle guidance of Ulrike and Lama, we grew from someone who only knew how to say Trishidele to scholars who, with not only knowledge, but also respect and empathy to the communities that we study about. However, life at the center does not stop at learning and researching. We also had our fair share of fun when we're doing our social gathering, when we're doing pub visits after the Tibetan graduate seminars. We have our annual Loser celebration and also end-of-term garden parties. A few years have since passed. Now, having completed my MPhil and started my DPhil research, I've realized that the only constant in the Oxford system is the impermanence of its people. Graduate students often stay for just 1 and 2 years, and visiting scholars also come and go. But like in the middle of this constant change, the Tibetan and Himalayan Study Centers has remained the most steadfast support and also continuous source of inspiration in my academic life. Beyond Ulrike and Lama, our community of resident scholars, including people like Rob, Kathy, George, Fernanda, and Heather, among others, have all contributed to keeping the center intellectually vibrant and also welcoming. In the years to come, as my fellow students and myself depart from this place of comfort, I believe that the center will continue to be lively, stimulating, and ever-inspiring for the future generations. People sometimes ask me, if you want to study about Tibet and the Himalayas, why don't you stay in Asia? Why come all the way to England? Having stayed here for a few years, I can now confidently say that I'm very proud of its deep and long history. Since its foundation by Professor Michael Aris, and when Professor Charles Ramble joined as the first lecturer at the turn of the millennium, the center has grown into one of the largest clusters of Tibetan studies in the United Kingdom. It brings together scholars from diverse disciplines, including religious studies scholars, through historians, anthropologists, linguists, to even religious practitioners. And although our methodologies and perspectives might differ, we remain united in our deep connection to the people, the places, and the texts that we study. The legacy of the center is also not something that exists only in the past. These days, when you walk into the Nizami Ganjavi Library in the Asian and Middle Eastern Studies Center, or if you walk into the Wolfson Library and open a book in the Tibetan study section, the Garuda stem marks that most of these books are actually from the Aris collection. It serves as a constant reminder for us that our center remain indebted to Professor Michael Aris for his foundation, its scholarship, and above all, its people. It is truly an honor to share with you a small glimpse of life at the Tibetan Himalayan Studies Center here at Oxford, especially on this special occasion that marks its 10th anniversary of Aris lecture, and also as the center march into the second quarter of the century. I would like to take this opportunity to send the center my most auspicious wishes and hopes that it will continue to prosper as a nurturing ground and a shelter for many generations of Tibetan and Himalayan scholars to come. Thank you.